In this video, we'll look at the Congressional Reconstruction during the remainder of Andrew Johnson's administration, that brief period from 1866 to 1868, and then we'll look at the election of 1868 at the end of this video. If you recall, in previous videos, we talked about the fact that Andrew Johnson was a very Southern-centric politician from Tennessee, and he was a moderate Republican, and when Lincoln was assassinated, he became president and fought with the radical Republicans who wanted to really put some pressure on the South to address the status of African Americans, and it was getting to be very caustic. Well, the radical Republicans had won the off-year congressional elections in 1866, so when the Congress returned in early 1867, the radical Republicans could override any veto that President Johnson gave, and so that again is why we call it Congressional Reconstruction, because in the end the Congress had the power, the true political strength. Some of the first bills that Congress passed after the elections of 1866 were collectively known as the Reconstruction Act of 1867, and you can see it here on the left here. They essentially implemented the harsher and more demanding radical Republican Reconstruction plans. They rejected the Southern state governments that had come in under Lincoln and Johnson during presidential Reconstruction, and they divided the South into 5 U.S. military districts, each under the rule of an Army general. There was Virginia and Tennessee in one, North and South Carolina in another, Alabama, Georgia, and Florida in one, Mississippi and Arkansas in one, and finally Louisiana and Texas. For states to be remitted, Congress now required ratification of the 14th Amendment. You may recall the 14th Amendment, which stated that everyone born in the United States was a citizen, and that no government could abridge the constitutional rights of citizens. Also, earlier there had been an ironclad oath requirement for the South. Well, the Supreme Court had ruled that such an ironclad oath, saying that you never voluntarily taken up arms against the United States, was unconstitutional because it applied to past behavior. Well, Congress passed now new legislation demanding only that elected officials going forward in any remitted states would have to take the ironclad oath, trying to get around the limits of the Supreme Court. The new radical Republican-dominated Congress also passed the Tenure of Office Act, and you can see it here. Abraham Lincoln had tried to bring in all elements in his administration. So he had radical Republicans and he had moderate Republicans, he even had some Northern Democrats, in his cabinet and in his administration. Well, Lincoln's gone, but some of his radical Republican cabinet secretaries were still there and were under Johnson. And many of the radical Republicans feared that Johnson would fire them. So if you recall, to be a cabinet secretary, you had to get approval of the Senate. And what the Tenure of Office Act said was, well, constitutionally, if you need the approval of the Senate to be a cabinet secretary, then a president can't fire a cabinet secretary unless they get the approval of the Senate. And, they were afraid that the Johnson in his fight with radical Republicans would start firing all these cabinet secretaries. Now, this Tenure of Office Act is of constitutional dubiousness. I mean, it's never been before that Congress would have to approve a president firing a cabinet secretary. They serve at his pleasure. But nevertheless, it was obviously a dig at Andrew Johnson. For a while, President Johnson didn't really react. But then in late 1867, he decided to challenge the Tenure of Office Act, and he fired one of the more outspoken of the radical Republicans in his cabinet, left over from Lincoln's presidency, Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, and he did so without consulting the Senate. When Johnson then appointed a new Secretary of War, Stanton refused to leave. Stanton even barricaded himself in the War Department and gave orders to have any new appointee arrested if he tried to take the building by force. When Johnson fired Stanton, the radical Republicans in Congress passed 11 articles of impeachment in early 1868. Now, you may be familiar with impeachment. Impeachment is a process whereby the House issues articles of impeachment, which is kind of like an indictment, and it goes to a trial in the U.S. Senate to see whether the president is kicked out of office. To do so requires a supermajority, a two-thirds vote. To kick them out, what warrants impeachment? Well, according to the Constitution, if you break a law or you commit so-called high crimes and misdemeanors. Well, the radicals and Republicans said, well, Johnson here broke the law, and they passed 11 articles of impeachment. The first 9 basically revolved around him violating the Tenure of Office Act, while the last 2 charged him with trying to bring Congress into, quote, disgrace, ridicule, hatred, contempt, and reproach, unquote. It was, of course, big news, and everybody wanted to get a ticket. You know, it's not like it's on radio or TV or anything. And so people lined up to join. Here's an admittance ticket. You see March 13th, 1868, U.S. Senate impeachment trial of President Johnson. Here's a contemporaneous drawing of the trial, and it looks like the visitor galleries packed, and like I say, it was big news. When the vote came, the radical Republicans in Congress fell 1 vote short of the supermajority required to convict Johnson. It was 35 votes for conviction and 19 against. But for the remainder of 1868, however, Johnson was essentially like a lame duck. He was weak, and the Republicans had no intention of renominating him in the 1868 presidential elections. He'd been part of the so-called National Union ticket in 1864, as Lincoln had called it, and now they just want to get rid of him. As the 1868 elections approached, more southern states began to ratify the 14th Amendment and thus enter the Union. The 14th Amendment was formally adopted in July 1868, and it's really one of the most important of the constitutional amendments. Shown here is a newspaper article on the 14th Amendment's ratification. When there were still U.S. troops present, former Confederates formed what we call known as the Ku Klux Klan, which sought to terrorize any freedman who tried to assert his or her own rights or tried to vote. They wore hoods to hide their identity, and they came out often at night as sort of night riders to commit violence. Here you can see a couple of pictures of them. You know, if you get uppity, so to speak, or you try to vote, you're going to have your door fly open, and someone's going to take a pot shot at your kids or your wife, as you can see in this picture. One of the founders of the Reconstruction era Ku Klux Klan was the former Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest, shown here. In the 1868 election, the Republicans unanimously nominated Ulysses S. Grant. It was sort of a no-brainer. Grant didn't have any political background. Everybody knew him as a war hero, and he let it be known that he would not fight the radical Republicans in Congress. Some Democrats wanted to turn around and nominate Johnson for their party, but they rather decided on New York Governor Horatio Seymour, shown here. In many ways, the Democrats ran on simply an anti-equality platform for African Americans. Grant won overwhelmingly in the Electoral College, including in many states of the former Confederacy, because the U.S. troops remained, and that therefore ensured that the freedmen could vote. It was the first election in which freedmen could vote. 3 states, Texas, Mississippi, and Virginia, had not yet been readmitted, so they didn't vote, and you can see them in brown here. With U.S. troops still in the South, African Americans were assured of the vote, as I say, and not surprisingly, therefore, African Americans began to win in a number of local and state offices in the former Confederate states. I should add later, in 1870, Hiram Rhodes Revels, shown here on the right, became the first African American elected to Congress when he won a Mississippi Senate seat. In any event, this concludes the video on the period of Congressional Reconstruction from the Congressional elections in 1866 to the presidential election of 1868, the dying gasp of the Andrew Johnson presidency.